Hey everyone, we're here to do an installation on our C6 Corvette with our Mini Mantis kit. The shop's currently up and running, the water jet's cutting, there's welders going, so it may be a bit sound disrupted, but this is the bracket. This gets sandwiched between the wheel bearing and the knuckle. We use the factory tie rod pickup to grab the other part of the bracket, and then we have two adjustment ranges here. For this install, because I have stock control arms, stock wheels, just the whole car is stock, there's not even coilovers on it. We're gonna run it in the moderate angle improvement position. This is gonna give us a 10 to 12 degree difference in angle or improvement in angle. And the wheel will actually not hit anything. And this is just a stock wheel with no spacers, no nothing. And then if you wanna run it in this position here, you will need aftermarket control arms, lower offset wheels so it sits a bit wider, you got better clearance, and so on. So I've got my table here of tools. We've got our locking plates. The locking plate goes on the bolt. This prevents it from ever backing out because we're just threading it into a nut. And without this, from vibration, this could vibrate out, fall out, and you'd lose the tie rod. So we have this locking plate that goes on, uses a small Allen head bolt with a nylock nut. That prevents this from ever backing off. This is a caliper spacer. It's the same thickness as the bracket, just to match the offset of the rotor. And then this is our outer tie rod sleeve that simply just goes onto the factory inner tie rod. For the knuckle, you only need to replace the upper two bolts because the lower bolt is in a recessed or countersunk hole, so it's got plenty of thread to use even though we're adding 5 millimeters of thickness. So you only need to replace the upper two. Other than that, it's a very straightforward install, and we're going to show you how to do it in like 10 minutes or less. So obviously the first thing you do after you take the wheel off is remove the caliper. We're doing this on the ground. We have a hoist. It's just to show this is not a big job. You can easily do it one side at a time with just a jack and a jack stand. So once you got the rotor and the caliper off, the next thing to do, you could either do the tie rod or you could do the wheel bearing. Doesn't really matter. We're gonna do the tie rod so that I'm able to rotate the knuckle and get at the bearing bolts easier. And we're gonna jump the gun and put some penetrating fluid on some of the stuff that I know is a bit tricky to get. When I say that, I'm mostly referring to the threads on the tie rod, as we have to back the jam nut all the way up, and the control arm bolt, or ball joint I should say, needs to be dropped in order to get the bottom bearing bolt. So we're just gonna put some penetrating fluid on it, let it soak in, so that nut comes off easy because it's pretty tricky. Good thing we're changing these because these boots were both torn and on their way out. Okay, next up is the bearing. It is a T55 Torx. Usually they're not too bad to take off. I could definitely expedite this with the big unit. We're going to tackle the lower ball joint. We let it soak for a couple minutes. The last one I let soak for a little while, and it was super easy. So it's not very often that you'll get lucky by just being able to take the nut off. Usually you need to put an Allen wrench or socket inside of the ball joint. It's there. So we'll see if we can do it with just the socket and a wrench. But what happens is it just starts rotating the ball joint, and there's not much you can do about that. You can apply pressure on the knuckle and try and keep it from rotating, but usually on this, it just keeps going. So, and it looks like we got super lucky. We are completely off. Not gonna complain about that. So just to show what I was talking about, there's a 6mm socket here. Usually you have to put an Allen key here and then use a wrench and rotate the ball joint because it normally spins, but we were lucky enough it just came off. So give the knuckle a couple whacks. There. Just use that one frame. Makes me look a lot better. So we need the knuckle to come up off the ball joint. We don't even have to take it off. We just need it to gain access to the bottom bearing bolt, which is again a T55. So we can blast it out. Ooh, a bit dramatic. Yeah, so that normally doesn't just fall out. Usually it's a bit seized, but that's what you got to do. This is pretty much the extent of everything that you need to take off. We now just inspect, clean, and prepare for installing our bracket. There's only one thing that you need to do to install our bracket, and that is grind a little bit on the bottom right here. There's a seam here that needs to be flattened. You just use a basic grinder with a flat disc or a hard disc. Flatten it to equal the same plane as the tie rod, and then you're good to go. And we're already at the part where we get to put the bracket on. So I'm just gonna grab all the bits that I need, bring them all over. So it'll be easiest if you put the bracket on the bearing first and then install it all as one unit. It's really easy to put on. This is the new tie rod mount bolt. Washer on top. And then this is what I was talking about. We're replacing the top two bolts. This is a 60 mil, this is a 50 mil. And the bottom bolt you leave, it's got plenty of thread to go all the way through the bearing still. We can go ahead and tighten up the bottom bolt again. I still got my Torx bit on. And for the new socket head bolts, it's just a 10mm Allen head. So we'll check these with the ratchet, sorry. Make sure they're good and tight. Torque to factory spec after. Good, good. We can go ahead and put the lower ball joint nut back on. And we're going to need to use our Allen key and a wrench to get this tight. It's a 6mm. Put it in the top of the ball joint stud. It's probably a bit corroded, so you might have to tap it in. And basically we need to rotate the middle of the ball joint and keep the nut still so that we can seat the taper. And once the taper is seated, you don't really need the Allen head anymore. Let's tighten up this bolt. It is a 19mm or a 3/4, whatever you're using. Check that by hand because that gun is it's a bit much for tightening things. It's like 1,200 foot-pounds or something, so good. And once that's tight, you now have officially a knuckle with a double shear tie rod pickup point that has two options for drifting, you have a moderate angle improvement and then a maximum or extreme angle, whatever you want to call it. Like I said before, the inside one is if you have aftermarket arms that are wider and allow for a lot more clearance. And the first position here is if you just want an improvement, but you don't want to do anything crazy. And we've actually found that you are also able to run the tie rod in the factory position as well. The only thing it would take is a longer bolt that can go through the bracket, the heim joint, and the knuckle. So you could reconnect this here as well if you even want to go back to factory geometry and track the car. You're still getting a very high-end spherical bearing on the outside, and then you're using a high-grade bolt that's passing through a single circle and then a circle on the top. So it's still a pretty tight fit. You're not using the taper anymore, but the bracket being bolted to the knuckle here, extending the length of the hole without using the taper, is still a super solid connection point. It would just be recommended to check this before, maybe during the day, and then again before you drive again, bolt checking this bolt whenever you were using it in the factory position. But for drifting, you probably will just leave it the way it is. This simply goes in its position here or here. And for this street car, stock wheels, doesn't even have coilovers, OEM everything, and we're just gonna send it at the track in our next episode. And I'm actually gonna be doing a comparison between this being in the factory position and then this being in our first position. And just because I'll put it even on the furthest in position with everything stock, and we're probably gonna see where our interference points are with the wheel and with the knuckle and the caliper bolts to the control arm and a whole bunch of stuff. So let's continue. The rest is pretty simple. We're gonna take this jam nut on the inner tie rod and we're gonna thread it all the way back to pretty much the shank. And we're gonna take this and we're gonna thread it all the way on, because this almost needs to be at its shortest position from what I've found. So yeah, let's do that and then we'll see what the angle's like. The only thing you gotta do is run your bolt up through both plates. Okay, so we got our tie rod in, our bolts nice and tight. I'm just gonna put this locking key on. It's got a pretty wide range, so chances are when you tighten it up, you'll probably not have to turn it anymore, but just turn it until the slot lines up with this hole so that you can drop this little bolt through. It's not on, we're good. And that's it. That's how you install our tie rod adapter Mini Mantis kit onto the C6 Corvette. The C5 and the C7 are all the same, but their knuckles are all, C7 is a lot different, C6 is slightly different, C5 is what we started with. So the benefits of the kit are the adjustability, serviceability, reliability, and it actually pushes the bearing out 5 millimeters, giving you just that much more clearance on your wheels to your control arms. So if you do decide to run this kit, put a spacer on and increase your wheels offset, you're gonna have tons of clearance. And this kit's gonna work really well. It's super solid. This is an alloy steel with a double shear design. If you buy this kit, you'll be set, and you can always return the car back to its factory style, because you're not wrecking anything of the knuckle. You're not cutting the tie rod pickup completely off to the point where this knuckle would only be good for drifting. This knuckle is still good for track, drift, and whatever else you want to do with it. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this rotor caliper back on. That's super basic. We're going to take this car out to test, and we're going to show you how all these 3 positions behave on the track with me behind the wheel. Thanks for watching. This is a really basic install, and we'll see you guys in the next video where we start drifting our daily driven C6 Corvette.